Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We've got a really nice group of people online who are continuing to join, which is always very encouraging. Today, we're very lucky to have two speakers collaborating, associated with RARI and talking to us about new research. I think that's a trifecta of exciting things. The paper that they're talking to us about today has just been published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of South Africa. I think almost all of you would know our speakers personally, but for those who don't, I'll just say something very quickly about each of them. The first speaker is Dr. Sam Challis. Sam is head and a senior researcher at the Rock Art Research Institute, which is hosting the seminar. And very briefly, his research focuses on the interaction between hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, and farmers, as well as Europeans, as expressed in rock art around the world, and the reverse gaze that rock art can offer historians. And then our other speaker is Professor Brian Stewart, who is a Paleolithic archaeologist in the Department of Anthropology and also curator of African archaeology at the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And also very briefly, Brian's research focuses on the archaeology of prehistoric hunter-gatherers in Africa, especially Southern Africa, with a particular interest in the evolution of the profound adaptive flexibility that is the hallmark of our species. So thank you both for agreeing to do this talk, and over to you as soon as you're ready.
Thanks so much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Thank you so much, David, and RARI more generally for the invitation to speak. It's really nice to speak on something that we've just published, so we actually know what we're talking about. I feel like half the time when I'm speaking, ideas are just sort of coming together. And in this case, Sam and I have been working on this for a number of years. It's really a COVID project. In some ways, it came together while we were, locked down on separate continents in various states of sequestration. And we're going to try to address one possible way, and one possible time during which ancient late Holocene hunter-gatherers in the Maloti-Drakensberg Mountains of Southern Africa became very much sort of spiritually in love and in many ways culturally infatuated with Africa's largest antelope, the eland. This is something that, as we're going to see, was pointed out by Patricia Vinicum at the outset of her career. It's quite obvious to anybody who's walked around those mountains just how important this animal is, given the incredible numerical dominance of it on the landscape. And so it's been an important research theme in Southern African archaeology and rock art for some time. And so we're going to give one idea. There's some contrasting ideas out there, and it really builds. These ideas came together when Sam and I were before COVID. When Sam and I should say, we began to bat them around when we were up for a kind of a fact-finding trip up in Sislaba-Tebe in the southeast corner of Lesotho, in preparation for a new project that I've started developing the Middle Stone Age archaeology at that site. That's one of several sites excavated by Pat Carter. I've been working in Lesotho since 2008, sort of trying to redevelop the Middle Stone Age archaeology of the area after Pat's seminal work back in the 1970s. And so we were up there for a trip, also doing some work on a possible heritage trail that we're still trying to get together. And we started to have chats about papers that we were just about to publish. I was about to put out something with Peter Mitchell, who I think is here. If he is, hello, Peter. And on this sort of recurrent dietary changes that we were noticing in especially cooler periods throughout the late Pleistocene and into the Holocene in the region. And we argued for intensification on aquatic resources as a response to dwindling large game resources through time. At the same time, and as Sam will talk about in a little bit, Sam was working in a hyper-local way up in Sislaba-Tebe on some really interesting rock art within or very close to the national park there, and exploring ideas of sort of the excess amounts of potency that would have been generated when eland gather in that area in these very rich high altitude grasslands during summertime bursts of nutrition and aggregations of people and the kind of ontological control that would have been required of the kind of negotiations that people would have had to undertake, and the kind of dangers and the mitigation of the dangers, both supernatural and social, that people would have had to engage in. This was coming out, or we were thinking about these things at the same time that a third study was just published right when we were up in Cislabitebia, and these were the first directly dated rock paintings from Southern Africa by Delphine Bonneau and RARI's own David Pierce. Really seminal work. I know that they had published some earlier stuff on protocols and dating, but this was the first time that we got a really good sense of when a particular corpus of rock art, namely, as we're going to talk about, polychrome eland, dated to. And it was quite surprising to us, and it seemed to really coalesce a lot of kind of independent ideas that we were having together, and a kind of rough new hypothesis began to take shape, and that's what we've then began exploring as we moved into the COVID lockdown, et cetera. I think it's important to say at the outset, and without belaboring it or getting too involved in it, is that our research draws a lot of inspiration and really direct inspiration, and Sam has been working on this longer than myself, on the kind of so-called new paradigm, new animisms, or ontological turn paradigm in hunter-gatherer anthropology and archaeology, and basically the idea behind this is the recognition that hunter-gatherer lifeways cannot be divided between the sacred and the profane, that these two aspects of life are completely indivisible, that everything, even the most mundane tasks, are often or always shot through with very deep spiritual resonance. And this has obvious implications for Southern African archaeology that we're only really beginning to explore. There's only been a handful of papers. I've just published a book on Doomfield Midden, a later Stone Age site in the Western Cape, where I apply some of these things to domestic campsites. John Kinahan's been working on similar things, Sam in the rock art realm, and several others. Mark McGranahan, of course, Charlie Arthur, and several others. And I think it's kind of a wide open subfield, to be honest. I mean, it sort of blows one's mind that even something as seemingly mundane as a pile of bones at a campsite may not actually have been so, and may not, the structured behaviors that led to the deposition of those kind of things may have been really supernaturally charged. And if we move back, not just to the Kalahari ethnography, as we're going to talk about in a minute, but beyond that to the ethnohistory before a lot of the spiritual life of the San was degraded by the vagaries of colonialism. I think we can, and of course, Southern Africa is a wonderful place to do that, especially because of the, sorry, I've got some weird message coming up, especially because of the Blake and Lloyd archive, among others. We can really begin to explore the full potential of the new animisms paradigm for Southern African archaeology, especially in the Holocene, and I would say especially in the late Holocene, being mindful not to project back too far into the past. I hope this talk roadmap is accurate. We've shuffled things around quite a bit, but we're going to talk just very briefly in like 3 seconds about our projects and how this ties them together. I'll introduce the Maloti-Drakensberg. I know it doesn't really need much of an introduction, especially to this audience. Sam will then take over talking about shaded polychrome eland paintings, and we'll talk then about how we make sense of them and other rock art images. We'll move on to dietary and spiritual changes that we hypothesize were occurring during a specific period of cooling in the late Pleistocene between about 3,000 and 2,000 years ago, the so-called Neoglacial, one of several late Holocene cooling periods that we have proxy evidence for throughout Southern Africa, and the Neoglacial registers particularly strongly in the Maloti-Drakensberg, which is a sensitive high altitude zone, of course. And then we'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts about our hypothesis of how people became elands people in the Maloti-Drakensberg. This is just a slide to show some fancy, pretty pictures of the two projects we've been working on. I've been working with Genevieve Dewar at the University of Toronto on a project we catchily acronym AMEMSA, or Adaptations to Marginal Environments in the Middle Stone Age. It's been, mainly involved with re-excavating a number of key sites that were originally excavated by Pat Carter, who, although being fabulous in many ways, excavated in artificial stratigraphic units, and of course was excavating before you could date beyond the radiocarbon ceiling, and I guess more recently than the radiopotassium floor, I suppose, and therefore could not establish chronological control really into deeper into the late Pleistocene and potentially beyond. So we've been working up there since 2008. We've just begun new excavations at Hasalogia, where you can see here at the top left, wonderful rock shelter up in Sislabetebe, and we've got dates of 50,000 years right at the surface, and it's a 3-meter deep sequence. So we're very excited about exploring kind of early engagements, human engagements with the highland environment from that site. Sam, on the just on the other side of the Drakensberg Escarpment in the Matatiel region, has been working both developing the rock art of that area with an emphasis on contact, but also other periods as well. And very importantly, and I think crucially, and this really goes to the heart of this talk, also doing excavated archaeology and attempting to marry those records. It's a bold thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do, as he'll tell you in a moment. And I think traditionally in the absence of dates, this has been a kind of a pipe dream in many ways, and one that is something that everyone really strives for: the power of unlocking the chronological potential of the rock art and anchoring it to the absolutely dated excavated archaeological record is almost boundless. And so I think hopefully what we're going to show today with these new fabulous dates with the work of Delphine and David, we even though we have far too few of them so far, that's no fault of their own. It's very hard to obtain the kind of rigorous dates that they've managed to get. We need more of them. That's a big caveat at the outset, but nonetheless, they are highly suggestive. We hope to demonstrate of the potential of pairing these records. So this region, I think, doesn't need a huge amount of introduction. Many people in RARI obviously work here due to the incredible density of rock art. This slide is just to show that even though we talk about it as kind of a monolith, the Maloti-Drakensberg is anything but. It's really ecologically diverse. It has steep, not just topographic and landform gradients, but also marrying up to those steep rainfall gradients, both east-west and north-south. If you're in one part of the Drakensberg and you travel to a very short distance to another, sometimes it's difficult to believe you're in the same region. I mean, between the Eastern Free State and the Northern KwaZulu-Natal Drakensberg, or between the latter and the Eastern Cape, I mean, they look completely different from one another. And so there's a lot of diversity and microhabitat aspects to this area that makes it particularly interesting and a really, really phenomenal place to work, in addition to just being dazzlingly beautiful and culturally just spectacular, both from a hunter-gatherer perspective and, of course, from a contemporary modern perspective as well. It's a wonderful part of the world that we both adore. One thing that we've noticed, and I think is not an artifact of research intensity, and kind of goes against what one might suspect, is that even though it's the highest and the coldest and the most widespread sort of mountainous, the most deeply incised, the most rugged part of the region, the highlands of Lesotho are the most continuously occupied, or at least the most recurrently occupied. And now we don't have a great handle on that yet. We need more dates. We need more sites. There's a lot of patchiness, both spatio-temporally to the record. But when Peter Mitchell and I compiled the radiocarbon dates and binned them very simply, we were really taken aback by just the endurance of people in that region. It used to be thought, and it might still be, that very often this was a seasonally occupied marginal region. Pat Carter was talking about it in these terms, and we're really changing our ideas on the potentiality and the marginality of the Lesotho Highlands. Yes, it was cold. Yes, it was challenging. But once people understood how to survive and adapt in that region and pass that knowledge down, and we're getting a glimpse of that with some of the really old sites that we're digging. Medicani goes back to about 83,000. Hasaloja will almost certainly be older. From the Medicani record, we've published the MIS isotope stage 5 data from the basal layers, and there's no landscape learning going on in those layers. They know how to use that landscape. It is very clear that these are professional Afromontane dwellers, even back at 80,000 years. I think the secret of peopling and learning that landscape goes deeper than that. And so that's part of the reason we're trying to get at those kind of archives. Once people could do that, they were comfortable in that area. That doesn't mean that they didn't abandon it, and it doesn't mean that it didn't suck at certain times. It almost certainly did, and we're going to talk about one of those times in the late Holocene, and we'll talk about some larger themes of especially what cold periods, temperature excursions did to the ecologies of the area, and how that would have had negative impacts, especially on large game populations, on which people in this area especially would have been probably pretty keen on getting their hands on, given that plant foods during these times would not have been as accessible. Hope I'm making sense. So just some pretty pictures of the region and some key sites. We're not really talking at all about Medicani, although I just mentioned it, so I wanted to show a photo of it. Very important in the rock art world for reasons that all the RARI folks know. Sohonghong has some very important rain animal capture imagery that Sam's going to touch on in a minute when we give some background on ethnographic and ethnohistoric frames of reference. A key site, absolutely key site for this talk and for our paper, and for which we must thank Peter Mitchell for finding it and excavating it so well, is the site of Dikwang, which is not far from Sohonghong, just north of the confluence of the Sohonghong River and the Senku. It's only just a few kilometers from Sohonghong. And this is a open air, well, it's a buried rock shelter, actually. Eland hunting or large game hunting, especially eland hunting turned fishing campsite that really covers the period of interest for our hypothesis, which is that neoglacial period between about 3.5 or 3.2 and about 2,000 years ago. So it's just it's a fabulous site. I hate to say it's one of a kind because I hope we find more, but so far it is absolutely unique. There's nothing like it, and it's really to Peter's credit that he found it and recognized the importance of it. I mean, he'd been working in that part of the world for a while, and took rapid steps to excavate it because it was disappearing. And now, if you walk by it, it's incredibly degraded. There's very little intact deposit left because of the violent flooding of the Senku River that washes right by the site. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. I'll cover the rock art just as not to break things up, and then I'll hand it over to Sam in a minute. These, there are, you guys probably know, I'm assuming thousands, many thousands of, maybe tens of thousands of rock art, certainly images and maybe sites in the Maloti-Drakensberg. This is the tiniest selection of them. These are important for the development of our hypothesis. Rain snake, Sislabetebe J08, especially those two are quite new, newly discovered and newly published sites by Sam and his team. Quite important sites. Mount Tyndall and Storm and Chamiso or Chamiso are Eastern Cape Drakensberg sites near Maclear. Those have dated polychrome eland paintings that have been developed by David Pearson and Delphine and their team. So they're very, very important sites. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the top left, which is this background map of South Africa, this little call out, or not a call out, but the opposite, whatever the hell that's called, which has all these little mountain icons with little acronyms. And these are COM and other interior San ethnohistorically documented rainmaking sites, Karoo and Southern Kalahari rainmaking locales. And some of the testimony from the historic 19th century COM hunter-gatherers in the interior are fundamental for our understanding of rainmaking at altitude and the importance of mountains and orographic rain effects for this kind of constellation of beliefs in San idiom. Altitude is crucial for obvious reasons to rain, and mountains are intertwined with rain. And we think the Maloti-Drakensberg, being the largest, most widespread, the highest mountain system in Southern Africa, was a rain-making place par excellence. And we're going to talk about some of those themes in a minute as Sam gets into things. Just some pictures of some of our favorite people. I didn't have the honor of meeting this power couple. I've heard tons about them. I got to Cambridge for a postdoc just like a year after Pat Carter passed away, unfortunately, and I never got to meet Pat Vinicum. I know numbers of people on this call knew them well, but they really were pioneers, goes without saying, and they understood at the very beginning. In fact, their project was designed to take advantage of the dual potentialities of the parietal painted and the excavated, the clearly underdeveloped but extraordinarily obviously rich, given the number of rock shelters and the size of some of the shelters, the two archaeological records for which the Maloti-Drakensberg has become so famous, and the possibility of pairing these two. That was, for both of their individual justifications, the other record. So for Pat Vinicum, the excavated record, and for Carter, the painted records were individually large parts of their research rationales. And their ultimate goal was to twin them. And, there were all sorts of things working against them, not least of which were marital issues eventually, but most seriously, the inability to chronologically anchor the painted record. And now I think with the dates that are coming out, we're finally able to possibly break that logjam. And this harkens back, as we talk about in the paper, to the three-ply cable of ethnography, rock art, and archaeology that Lim Wadley and Sven Osman discuss in their 1997 paper, and the importance of developing those in tandem. And we've been able to tie ethnography with archaeology. We've been able to tie ethnography, of course, with rock art very successfully, most especially with David Lewis Williams's work and others. But the tying between the excavated archaeology and the rock art has eluded us, and so finally, hopefully, we're getting past that. Again, just to emphasize that the importance of the eland in the area numerically, this is something that was not lost on Pat Vinicum. An informant who was one of the last in a tradition to paint was painting an eland, and when he was asked to do so, Maputi, he responded, he's painting an eland because the mountain San were people of the eland. And Pat Vinicum took that wonderful expression for the title of her book, which was then reissued by Ben Smith and Peter Mitchell and other colleagues with a lovely accompanying compendium of an edited volume with wonderful articles as well. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Sam, and he's going to talk about shaded polychromes. So Sam, go for it.
Thanks, Brian, for that excellent introduction. I'll put my little camera on. Hopefully you can.
And let me know when you want me to change the slide, because I have control of
that. Yeah, I'll do that. That's great. Thanks. So I'm going to skip along pretty lightly over some of these slides because we included a little bit of basic info for those who are perhaps not so familiar with Southern African rock art who might be tuning in. So those of you, apologies to those of you who are, you'll know that a lot of this stuff back to front and inside out already. So the eland and the shaded polychromes. Eland is arguably the most conspicuous aspect of the region's rock art record, and there is a pronounced focus on that animal in the rock art. The largest African antelope, and one that is especially spiritually charged for San societies across the subcontinent. So it doesn't really matter necessarily where you go. The different San communities, different language groups will often refer to the eland as being God's favorite animal, or this sort of thing, or the animal with the most supernatural potency. But at some point in the past, paintings of these animals in the Maloti-Drakensberg not only came to numerically dwarf other subjects, but mountain societies began to paint them using an exquisite technique involving the shading of multiple colors to achieve highly naturalistic likenesses, which are accordingly termed shaded polychromes. So the things on the right there, and the one at the bottom that's Barnefeld. It's the famous one that we always use to wow our students and get them into rock art studies. I don't know how many people that one single image has pulled into studies of rock art, but it's a lot. there's your shaded technique. And so for the Maloti-Drakensberg communities, eland come to be the spiritual animal par excellence. And we're asking, when and why did montane foragers begin to focus so heavily on them? Okay, so the next slide. You got the next slide coming up.
Sorry, there's a train going by. I can't help that.
We can't really ask you to stop the train.
No. Go ahead.
Michigan Freight.
Yeah.
So just, again, this is background for people who might not necessarily be so familiar with it. I see we've got Pippa Scottness in the audience. So there are some who are not only familiar with the Blake Lloyd archive, but who have virtually written half of it. So how is it that we think how do we know what we think we know about the art? So for those people who think that we're just gazing and guessing, we take an ethnographically informed approach to get as close to the San idiom or the insider's perspective as possible. We have the work of the German linguist Wilhelm Blake and his sister-in-law Lucy Lloyd from the 1860s and 70s, who took down 13,000 pages of verbatim San testimony. We have the Kalahari ethnographies from the 1950s onwards. There's Lorna Marshall interviewing somebody on the left there. And our third register, and the one that we focus on today, is a singular account from a San man describing the paintings and the San belief system in the Maloti-Drakensberg, this hyperlocal example. And this was when the San man Qing, Q-I-N-G, spoke to Joseph Orpen in 1873, and Orpen wrote up the encounter and published it in the Cape Monthly magazine. Not before sending that same manuscript to Wilhelm Blake, the guy at the top, for comment, and whose informant, Diakquain, independently corroborated much of what Qing had said. So over a vast geographical difference, we've got this corroboration. And so in the next slide here, we've got this this schematic that I drew up, which is a picture of us, how we triangulate. We triangulate between these three registers in order to situate ourselves on the ethno-archaeological landscape. So where these three registers or multiple registers coincide or agree, that's when you are that's when it's your interpretations are strongest. Recent work in the Maloti-Drakensberg by Andrew Skinner has shown that all three registers are greatly supported also by the contextual communities in the mountains today, who are very often kind of discounted. Who wants to listen to what modern Basutu have to say in the Maloti-Drakensberg? Well, if you do go and ask, which is what Andrew and I have been doing over the last sort of 5-6 years or so, you find that a lot of what they say corresponds incredibly well with the Kham ethnography particularly, and with what Qing was talking about. So these are the communities who have inherited and whose ancestors contributed to the local idiom. For local Basutu, the Quetza, or the river pool, is still the place where the water snake lives and where it can be approached by those who have brokered relations with it. And so they're still talking about respectful behavior and approaching nicely and having to respect the water snake in the river pool, for example, and other entities on the landscape with the right kind of behavior. And that's one of the things that we focus on, of course, here. And so in the next slide, just another little bit of background. It was from that triangulation between these three ethnographic registers that Lewis Williams was able to expose the religious nature of the paintings, especially those relating to trance or healing, the trance or the healing dances. Things like the fly switches up at the top left there, they're only used at the dance. The dance postures, the bleeding from the nose caused by hyperventilation in the dance, and the metaphor of the antelope's death being one and the same thing as the death undergone by healers when they pass out in the dance. All of this to acquire supernatural potency to transcend realms in order to heal the sick, make rain, importantly, or control weather, and to influence the movements of the game. So healing, yes, but also don't forget to control the weather and to influence the movements of the game. As Qing himself said, to Orpen when pointing at the paintings, in situ, pointing at the paintings, said the men with the raybuck's heads, these therianthropes, these part human, part antelope people with raybuck's heads, i.e. those who have acquired raybuck potency or have raybuck potency, they tame elands and snakes, i.e. they can influence the game and the rain. That's arguably what he was saying. And so in the next slide, we can see some of this brokerage. Notice the people, the person at the bottom reaching out and holding onto the horn of the eland. This is something that Mark McGranahan and I published in 2016 when we asked ourselves, what do we think he's talking about when he says taming the taming elands and snakes, taming the game and taming the rain? What does that mean? And then we looked at these paintings, we see all these images of people reaching out in a not what we would call a non-realistic way and touching antelope and other animals, sometimes touching rain animals and other sort of strange things that you and I might say don't exist, but for the San were very real. And so in these images, we see shaded polychromes. So when I say shaded polychromes, I'm referring to these sorts of painted images, which usually depict eland, although hartebeest and raybuck are also painted in this way. And there's a couple of things like bush pig and aardvark and fish even that we'll see later that are shaded polychrome. But by contrast, the human figures tend to be unshaded. So there's less of an emphasis on humans. The naturalistic style can be misleading, however, and it has to be repeatedly pointed out that non-real subjects betoken the constant presence of the spirit realm and the brokerage of relations with non-human entities. So all the time, San are trying to behave correctly, do the right thing, behave respectfully towards other entities that are in their cosmos around them. Not just it's not a Judeo-Christian cosmology of heaven above and hell below. Everything is all around them all at once. It's arguably, as Andrew Skinner would say, unified cosmos. It's all one and the same thing. And you're constantly trying to broker relations with the things that are around you by way of navigating your way around. And so that harks back to the slide that Brian showed us earlier of the new animisms. And so we're taking a lead from Viveiros de Castro, from Bird David, from Willerslev and the like, not least Rane Willerslev. Here at the top left, an eland steps out from a crack in the rock face. So you have this constant sort of toing and froing through the veil, if you will. Here, one of the spirits of the dead, the Gawasi, on the top right, emaciated and skeletal with a large pelvis, with drawn in white, with skinny legs and a bulbous stomach. Bear that in mind, with the bulbous stomach, claws, and the gluttonous the bulbous stomach can indicate gluttony. The spirits of the dead are not immediate kin, but they're forgotten about, and thus antisocial, but they still love us and want to take us away. This person on the top right is passing between two eland. And here a human figure, also arguably a spirit of the dead with a distended stomach, bleeding from the nose. You can see the red marks across the nose there, holds the horn of an eland in a gesture of taming as the animal adopts a nice, calm, seated posture with its legs folded underneath it, which ties in with things men with raybuck's heads, as we shall see, which we've recently developed in this hypothesis of reconfiguring hunting magic, as I mentioned with Mark and with Andrew Skinner. Importantly, much of the San conception of potency and resource control is performed either physically or spiritually at elevation, so high up. You've got to get high up if you're going to achieve these things, whether physically going into the mountains or whether you're going into a trance in the trance dance or whether it's in a dream. These things happen at elevation. And we focus on the mountains where, at elevation, the summertime herds of eland aggregated in these enormous herds that, in the words of King, where Kachen, the trickster deity, where Kachen is, eland are in droves like cattle. So there's this huge concentration of potency up at altitude. That conception in the Maloti-Drakensberg in the next slide is is reinforced across the subcontinent. So those mountains that Brian pointed out earlier on the map, the other mountains all the way across the subcontinent, we have examples in the ethnography from different places. Here's just one of them from the where mountains are referred to as being spiritual and rain-making places, where the informant Kabo, who himself was a rain shaman, he made rain in his dreams, spoke of a grandfather talking to a grandson, who said to the grandson, "I will milk a she-rain, I will cut her. By cutting her, I will let the rain's blood flow out so that it runs along the ground. I will make all places wet." The grandson replied, "I understand, for the she-rain is drawing her breath, which resembles mist. If you must please go and cut the rain at the great water pits, which are on the mountain." So the water pits are on top of the mountain. The place where you make the rain is up. To which the old man said, "I will really ride the rain up the mountain, on top of which I always cut the rain. It is high, so the rain's blood falls down." So that's a classic example of this thing, but we find it all over the place, and not least in the Blake Lloyd. So in the next slide, we see a representation of the San cosmos. Sorry, Brian, we need to go back to the clouds. There we go. Thanks. So this is kind of like just a quick representation of the San cosmos. There in the foreground on the left, you can see eland migrating up into the spiritual hinterland of the high Maloti-Drakensberg to the summer grazing grounds. And I've seen them going up when the grass is lush and green, and going up and over into Lesotho, where the summer burst of grasses, which Brian's about to refer to now, is even greener and better grazing in the summer. But King said that it was only possible to get to those heights by following the eland and by passing through an otherwise impenetrable and freezingly cold mist to where the eland were in droves like cattle. So you can see the mist there. You've got to get up and you've got to pass through that mist. And so it's a spiritual undertaking to get from below the mountains up into the mountains to where these things happen. And in the next slide, we've got a picture of a rock shelter just on the other side of the escarpment. Weirdly, it's still in sandstone. So normally by this point, you'd be way up in the basalt. But at Challis, just across the escarpment, is an anomalous uplifting of sandstone sitting at 2,387 meters. And here's a rock shelter overlooking one of the best summer grazing valleys in the highlands at Challis. Eland, antelope, and cattle flock to it still during the brief window when the C3 grasses become palatable. Extremely inhospitable in winter months when snow, wind, and altitude can take the temperatures down to -20 degrees Celsius. When we were there, I think we got down to about -16 when we were back at our camp. But even during the day, it's a miserable place to be. So that photo looks nice and sunny, but I can assure you it's not a nice place to be in the winter. This is almost certainly a summer stopping place for the hunter-gatherers who follow the migrating herds of eland. A superabundance of meat and fat, which is what you would have with thousands, arguably, of eland congregating in this fantastic grazing ground. In the San idiom, this translates into a superfluity of qi, or supernatural potency. The place, having potency, is therefore both powerful and dangerous, especially dangerous in a sort of social sense, because people forget themselves and get out of control and forget to behave themselves. And so that can cause upset and danger in San society, where nice behavior is everything. And such circumstances would call for those who have the ability to influence and utilize the supernatural, individuals who have hunting magic, these people with the raybuck's heads, to fulfill their social responsibility, harness that power for the benefit of everybody. Both desirable and undesirable outcomes might transpire. So you have a problem of people harnessing that potency and either using it for good or it getting out of control, a little bit like electricity. It can be dangerous when it's not controlled properly. And so in the next slide, painted in this rock shelter, the next slide shows this human figure or human-like figure. Now that painting is one of the largest anthropomorphic figures in the entire subcontinent. It's about 1 meter long. It is a painting of arguably a ritual specialist heralding the potential dangers of such a superabundance of resources. He's got a bulging stomach evoking associations of gluttony and poor resource distribution. He's got tusks and 3 legs. And each of the 3 legs has clawed toes. One of them actually has six toes with claws on it. And it evokes leonine proportions of both power and gluttony. So when the San speak about lions, it's not good. And Jeremy's Customs and Beliefs has a couple of excellent passages on this and the interpretation of it. Lions, not good. Most things to do with lions, unlike the European conception of them being noble and brave and all this. Lions are the ancient dark enemies of humans. They're the worst things. They can't behave. They can't share their food. They're gluttonous. They fight and they kill you. So lions are not good. So if you call somebody a lion, that's a real insult, just like calling somebody a hyena is also. So those associations with beasts of prey and things like that in San society are very bad. So the hairiness and the claws and the teeth, the tusks. This figure also has lion's whiskers coming out of the face as well. That's actually down to the work of Alice Mullin, I should point out. That's her master's thesis there. So the figure in question may represent just such an instance of the strong ritual specialist struggling to control excess fat and potency while dealing with the entities above and below the water. So I think if we go quickly to the next slide, we have to go. We return to the words of King. So we've done the bit where we say, he says that it's the men with raybucks heads who tame elands and snakes, but he also said something else, and he said the people that we're looking at in the rock art were men who had died and now lived in rivers. They were spoilt at the same time as the elands and by the dances of which you have seen paintings. So this is what we bring up in, this is rock art 101 in first year. The paintings are of the dances. Anyone who questions that, we just refer them to the San people saying the paintings are of the dances, among other things. But the underwater thing that we want to bring particular attention to. So in the next slide there, Brian, if you got the next one up. Yeah, that's the one. We have all of this underwater imagery. And so we have this association of polychrome eland and rains things becoming associated with underwater imagery. We'll get onto the dates of this in a minute. At broadly the same time in the region's relative rock art sequence, paintings of eland in their new elaborate forms come to be strongly associated with paintings of underwater imagery, such as fish, eels, tortoises, and water snakes. All of these things are manifestations or things that belong to Kwa, the rain, regenerator of rivers and vegetation, and the associated animals. And so, look, you can see these things that we would say are not real people, and therianthropes, and even the eland antelope on the bottom right, with fish swimming, those little yellow fish and black fish swimming past. Then we have rain animals. There's David Whittleson's favorite rain animals with the fish surrounding the rain animals. And right on the far left of that little photograph there, you can see somebody with a stick brokering relations with that, is dealing with that rain animal that is underwater. So going underwater is a metaphor for trance in the spirit world, and brokering relations with this other entity that it is important to negotiate with. And so in the next slide we can see this in its most famous format, and these are the rain animals around Sahonghong. So we've got the famous rain animal from Sahonghong shelter that Joseph Orpen and Ping spoke about right in front of that image, and scores of us have been speaking about ever since. And then just a couple of years later, when I was during my PhD, I went there with Peter Mitchell, and we walked down the river and crossed over, and we rediscovered a site that Vinicum had reported, a site that we dubbed Rain Snake Shelter, that I returned to in 2009 with Jeremy, who's here. And we traced it, and we were just blown away at the time because, of course, King had pointed to the bovid one at the top, and he said that animal is a snake. and that's confused people for such a long time. And then when we actually found an animal, a rain animal that was being treated in the same way, being led by the nose and led out like this huge coiling serpent, which is a snake, we were then able to categorically state that, you know, these things belong to the same category of creatures that belong to the rain. The bovid thing is a manifestation of the rain. The serpent is a manifestation of the rain. The people who are capturing it, these are the people who can influence the weather. That's in shorthand. And so that's the background to our hypothesis. It's all concerning the control of resources and potency. And so we ask, in the next slide, we've just got a nice picture of a shaded polychrome. We ask, how then did eland come to be associated with fish and other rains things? So there's a connection that happens at some point, and we are trying to find out when and why it happens. And how does that relate to them becoming shaded? Why do they go from being even just polychrome and unshaded to being shaded polychromes? And so, Brian, I'll hand back to you for the next slide.
Sure. So Aaron Maisel, has opined on this. I mean, he's one of the people who's done the earliest work on trying to get some absolute dates from, if not directly on painted images, then on geological features sort of associated with them. And specifically, he was radiocarbon dating back in the late 90s and early 2000s, oxalate crusts that underlied the polychromes. What he was able to show is that polychromes are not super recent. It sort of was thought that because of their vividness that they must date to the last couple hundred years, and he was able to show categorically that that's incorrect. And instead, his dates calibrated to between 4,000 and 1,000 years ago. He didn't have an exact date for the paintings themselves. And so he sort of, I don't want to speak for him, but it seems like he looked around for potential sort of cultural stressors that would have happened at about this time, and he settled on what clearly was a major event in the lives of, or a series of events in the lives of hunter-gatherers of the late Holocene, which was the incursions of Bantu language-speaking agropastoralist peoples into the eastern parts of southern Africa, and up not far away from the base of the Maloti-Drakensberg Mountains, where they would have definitely been in contact with people who were themselves in contact via social networks with people in the mountain core. And he argued that polychromes potentially were a response to the heightened stress that these new groups sort of the destabilizing effect of these new groups as they entered into indigenous hunter-gatherer societies at about 2,000 years ago. But as we've said recently, Delphine Bonneau and colleagues have secured direct radiocarbon dates of so-called carbon blacks. These are incompletely combusted organics in the black pigments of rock art. These are important dates because they have been rigorously pre-treated. There's been multi-stages involving things like FTIR to determine that these are not charcoal-based paints. There's a big, there's a lot of criticisms about using charcoal portions of paints because you don't really know the how or where that charcoal was collected. It could be from, Middle Stone Age hearths for all we know. So these are incompletely combusted, portions of the organic parts of the binding agents and of the ingredients of the pigments themselves that are not charcoal. And there's a series of dates, and it looks like in every instance that the oldest dates for polychrome eland are falling within the 3,000 and 2,000 year old time envelope. And many of them are, the range of those the distribution, the probability distribution of those calibrated ages is going back towards the start of the so-called neoglacial period. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at the neoglacial, what was happening culturally and archaeologically at that time, armed with these new dates for the painted imagery, and to start to explore potentially what was happening and why this painting technique, if these dates are are reliable and if they are representative, and those, I think the former is, I think we can say yes. The latter is not 100% known until we have more. So that's, again, just a big caveat. There are very few of these things, but nonetheless, if both of those criteria are met, then we can begin to explore the possible reasons for why this kind of painting technique occurred at this time. And what we are settling on is not an external exogenous hypothesis like that posited by Aaron Maisel with cultural excursions of different people coming in, but something that's autochthonous and related ultimately to changes in climate and the kind of cultural, systemic, especially ontological responses of hunter-gatherers to those changes, and how that's changes in culture and diet are mediated through ontological spiritual mediations with important entities on the landscape. So, the Maloti-Drakensberg is one of very few parts of the African continent that has, very low temperatures due to its altitude. There's not many. Highland Ethiopia, the Atlas Mountains, and a few other places where temperatures go down to, below freezing for sustained periods in the wintertime. This is important because if you look at cross-cultural data on hunter-gatherer resource use, such as that published by Binford, which of course has its own problems, and there's criticisms of Binford which are perfectly valid, but we don't have a lot of other major compendia of hunter-gatherer ethnographies. One thing Binford noticed is that there's a couple different thresholds that he was able to sort of identify, looking at the central tendencies in his data. One thing he noticed is that below 15.25 effective temperature Celsius, hunter-gatherers have to store some kind of food. They really can't get by without some kind of storage. And below 12.75, they really can't depend on plants anymore as the major part of their diet. They have to intensify on something else, whether that's large game or aquatic resources. And if they're really intensifying, then large game is a very difficult option, because large game itself will be highly mobile in those situations, because large game themselves are dependent on plants. And so hunter-gatherers will need to be very highly mobile and moving around. And so aquatic resources become a great option because you can pack around them. And although they're not inexhaustible, they can really take kind of the pummeling that humans can throw at them with varying degrees of intensity. Africa itself, of course, is above both thresholds. The vast majority is above 15.25 effective temperature, again, except for those little mountain areas, not that little, again, the Atlas, Highland Ethiopia, and the Maloti-Drakensberg is another one, where effective temperatures are relatively low. Coming down to Southern Africa, to the Maloti-Drakensberg in particular, you can see that there's only a few parts of the subcontinent, among them the Drakensberg escarpment area, Highland Lesotho, and a little strip in the Karoo, that goes down below 14 Celsius effective temperature. And if temperatures went below that with climate change, these are contemporary temperatures, then we would have been down potentially below the around 13 effective temperature threshold for below which hunter-gatherers could no longer depend for the bulk of their diet on plants, and they would have had to intensify, and that would have precipitated quite sharp cultural and dietary changes. We know that the Maloti-Drakensberg got like that sometimes. Things went bad. Stefan Grubb and multiple colleagues, Stephanie Mills and many others working on some work of some earlier folks, Marker and so on, have done wonderful work developing the glacial and periglacial geomorphology of the region. We know that. And we now very, very nicely have some radiocarbon dated evidence for last glacial maximum and other late Pleistocene and possibly even late Holocene cold period periglacial and glacial landforms, things like protolith ramparts, things like moraines. We know that it got quite nasty up there. And of course, a lot of it depended on altitude and aspect and other things like that. But overall, in terms of resource outlay and what hunter-gatherers were depending on, these times could have been really quite challenging. And especially difficult was the fact that mountains are effectively, most mountains are kind of pyramidal shaped. And when you have belts that are relatively nutritionally impoverished occurring overbelts that are better to exist in, to live in. And when during cool periods, those alpine or higher altitude, more nutritionally impoverished vegetation schemes drop in altitude, they cover a larger proportion of the landscape in more nutrient deficient types of vegetation that are only seasonally nutritious for a short burst, usually in the growing season in summer. And what we see time and time again, this is what Peter and I have published, is that during these cool phases, large grazing ungulates would have faced stresses that probably would have forced longer range out migrations to forage during the difficult winter season, and shorter windows of incursions into the summer as they moved into the grasslands. And freshwater, certain species of freshwater fish would have also benefited from this. They spawn more readily in cold waters. And so you have kind of a natural ecological changeover effect of dwindling large grazing ungulate resources and possibly an increased number of freshwater fish spawning in the cooler meltwater replenished rivers of the highlands of Lesotho. Again, you can see this time and time again, it probably would have led to some population downturns. It looks like the last glacial maximum was a difficult period. It looks like very few people around, or at least not archaeologically massively visible. The same thing is true of the Antarctic cold reversal, the end of the Pleistocene. We're going to explore another one where it doesn't seem like people actually abandoned or became particularly less populous or visible on the landscape. But instead, they appear to have quite sharply changed their subsistence and as we're going to see, ontological regimes to cope with the new conditions that they found themselves in. As I said, Dikwaeng is an enormous part of this story. It is a hunting and fishing camp. The fishbone NISPs, the fishbone sample, is out of control, enormous. It is in the millions. It's a very, very important site and a very unusual site, as I've said. And Peter, Adrian Parker, and colleagues have done a great job of throwing the book of paleoenvironmental proxy analysis at this sequence and marrying that with the faunal assemblages, both terrestrial and aquatic, to understand how dietary changes coincided with climatic changes that the site's registering over the period of the neoglacial between about 3.5 and 2,000 years ago. Again, I should say the site goes beyond that. It goes more recently than that, but that's the period we're really interested in. So here's the kind of paleoenvironmental proxies that are summarized in this slide that we created for our paper from Dikwaeng, the data kindly offered by Peter Mitchell and Adrian Parker. And just a couple things to note. One is that you get a big spike in puid, that's C3, relatively unnutritious, unpalatable grasses during the neoglacial phase between about 3.2 and about 2,000 years ago, with a big spike in the late neoglacial. At the same time, you're getting a decrease in phytoliths that belong to woody vegetation in the late neoglacial. So it looks like woody vegetation is decreasing quite sharply from a peak in the early neoglacial to a massive descent in the later neoglacial. So the landscape is becoming colder, more C3 grasses, alpine belts moving down, and that woody vegetation that used to be very important browse for mixed feeders like eland, which rely on browse in the wintertime, would have really plummeted, and this would have forced probably longer range out migrations. And you can see that, I think, in the faunal record. What you have in the early neoglacial contrasts pretty sharply with the late neoglacial. You get a major ramping up of fishing. At the same time, you still have viable eland herds around on the landscape at that time during the early neoglacial. This would have been a moment of great resource bonanza for people. Eland would have been there to hunt with the newly covered, largely covered area with C3 grasses. The hunting window would have been narrow. It would have constrained the hunting window, but there would have been influxes clearly of eland that were taking advantage of this nutritional seasonal burst of C3 over a larger proportion of the highland landscape. And after about 2.6 million years ago, as we move into the late Neoglacial, we see that the eland populations just absolutely fall off a cliff. They crash to almost zero for the remainder of the sequence, whereas fishing just takes off and it remains very, very important until the very end of the sequence. So you're getting an early Neoglacial with lots of eland and fish around, a moment of a time of plenty. And you're getting then in the late Neoglacial an apparent crash in eland populations. We interpret that as an artifact of their abundance on the landscape, as opposed to a site formational change, because a big site formational change actually occurred before any of these changes at the site, but do not appear to be related to these dietary changes, by which time the site was no longer a rock shelter, but was open air. So Sam and I have come up with a kind of a two-phase hypothesis to try to explain this, and these feed directly into our hypotheses about the origins of polychrome painting and the origins of how eland, fish, and rain became fused with one another in the mountain psalm idiom. So we believe that in the early Neoglacial, fish and eland were both plentiful, bountiful. This would have created extended spring-summer aggregations. This is also reflected in the kinds of fish that are the kinds of fish species that are represented in these early levels, which have a longer duration of spawning events from the spring into the summer. People focusing on eland for a tight, constricted window of hunting where they needed to get it right would have needed to get up there early to prepare for the hunt, to gear up in a kind of Binfordian sense. And they would have, before the arrival of the eland in a very difficult time of year in the springtime, when there's not a lot of fat around, especially on the landscape, you don't want to protein poison yourself, like my colleague John Speth would caution you against. You can rely on fish, because fish are beginning to run at that time. If you make the necessary precautions, you need to basically negotiate with the entities on the landscape in order to bring the rains to make those rivers rise, and bring the rains to eventually rejuvenate the veld to make the eland arrive. So you have to undergo heightened negotiation with and respect behaviors towards both eland and the rain. And in this situation, when acting nicely, which is a classic calm behavioral trait towards very important entities with which you need to keep good relations with. One way to act respectfully, to act nicely to eland would be a newly embellished form of painting. And so we suggest that and we think that the radiocarbon dates are also suggesting that polychrome painting was born to fill this need in the early Neoglacial. That changed quite suddenly with the late Neoglacial after 2.6 million years ago. I've been teaching Paleolithic archaeology too long. 1,000 years ago, when the landscape became harsher, it became colder, C3 vegetation plunged right down into the lowest valleys in the highlands. You had less woody vegetation for eland to depend on, less browse. They would have been forced to undertake longer outmigrations, largely abandoning the highlands, not coming up that high. This would have robbed the highland populations of their kind of really preferred large game populations, and that resulted in a narrower, more targeted springtime fishing aggregation. And you can see that in the seasonality data of the fish species. They're targeting species that really only spawn in kind of like November, which is in the springtime. So they would not have remained there for summertime hunting. The occupational settlement pattern could have become more seasonal, more summertime focused. Importantly, though, the ontological fusion that was so effective earlier on between eland, fish, and rain endured, and clearly endured for, we suggest, for several thousand years, right up into the ethnographic present for informants like King to talk about it with European people that were venturing into that area for the first time. Sam, I'm going to hand it over to you because this is your bag, really. But just to say that there's some very suggestive imagery just around the corner from Dick Wang that's not dated, but tantalizing in what it possibly suggests.
But I think you can see that this is rock art research, but not as we know it. It requires a lot of background, and it's rock art research, but it's deep archaeological and deep time archaeological research too. So when you fuse the two together, you get a talk that's an hour and a half long. So yeah, so the reason that we put the hypothesis in there at that point is to bring together all of that background and show you why we ended up with this idea that there's this pattern, is an identifiable pattern. The archaeological, the faunal and the floral proxies are very tight. The dates from the shaded polychromes are excellent. They're very tight. They're not from exactly here, but we think they apply across the board. And so we're going to have to just go and get more dates, of course. But the site that's key to everything at Owing, and again, you know, thanks to Peter and co for excavating it so well, and also for taking me there. Peter took me there in 2007, and we got a 5-meter long ladder, and the paintings are 6 meters up in the air. You can see me there tracing the rock art site, 6 meters off the ground, with a local Masutu holding the bottom of the ladder, thankfully, because the shelter floor had been washed away by this little river that feeds into the Senku. So it's just around the corner from the main excavation. And in that rock art depiction, you have one of these upside down dying polychrome eland, and a dancer clapping, and possibly even also bleeding from the nose. You know, so putting it in the context of the trance dance, and so you have that image, and it is right next to. If we can go to the next slide, Brian. It is right next to, get my version of that up, a rain animal, and it's about 25 centimeters away from an image that's likely to be a fishing net with fish and a rain animal. So this is right next to that site that has these millions of fish bones in it. And so Peter put forward this hypothesis on the paper that we wrote, that the paintings probably collectively reference the acquisition of eland potency, the entrance of shamans into altered states of consciousness, and very probably rainmaking. Spring and early summer rains are preconditions for the spawning and migration of the Labiocapensis and Labiobarbus species that Brian was just talking about now. And these are events that offered people reasonably predictable opportunities for social aggregation, focused on the exploitation of rich concentrations of protein and fat in the form of fish. So people are aggregating here. They're coming here to anticipate. So in the early Neoglacial, at least, when the eland are still in droves like cattle, to anticipate the arrival of the eland herds. And so you aggregate there, and your immediate friends and family, and then friends from the wider Maloti-Drakensberg come and aggregate together. And so you'd have these tensions that would happen with the aggregation of lots of people. So still in the Kalahari today, people dance whenever they aggregate, because to try to alleviate these social tensions. And in a place like this, where you have this huge superabundance of supernatural potency, that is heightened. And so your negotiation with these entities on the landscape is also therefore arguably heightened. Not only with the entity that is the eland, but the entity that comes to be associated with the eland, the rain. So you have to make rain in order to make the rivers rise and the fish run, to bring the spawning fish up into the mountains, so that you can aggregate and therefore anticipate the arrival of the eland herds. And then you're negotiating with Kwa and the entities that are associated with the rain. You're going underwater, you're capturing rain animals and all of that kind of thing. So your respect behavior and your appropriate behavior and behaving nicely to influence the movements of the subaquatic game ties in with your negotiation with the terrestrial game. And so it all becomes part and parcel of one thing. So I think you can see already that, I hope it doesn't come across as being too confusing. There isn't a particularly good place necessarily to start with this interpretation, because every single aspect is intimately associated with the next. And so at this site we have them all coming together, so which is a beautiful thing. So that's a nice thing that takes us all the way back to 2008. But I think with the new evidence that we have pulled together from the surrounding region, the picture is starting to look a lot more rich. And so, yeah, in the next slide, Brian, I don't know if you want to bring us.
Well, it really is
that.
just to conclude with our new hypothesis, and this really just recapitulates what we've already said. And given we've run massively over time, I probably won't belabor it, but just the idea that the narrow neoglacial hunting season would have required enhanced mediation with supernatural forces on the mountain landscape, especially true of the rain that brought both the new grass and the game. Spring growth of those grasses were needed, so rain was needed, and of course you needed to then capture rain animals so that the grazers would finally arrive. But rain also brought the mass spawning of fish into the mountain zone as well, and so in the process, the rain, eland, and fish became ecologically and ontologically linked during the neoglacial, we suggest. The need for the heightened spiritual negotiation engenders a new elaborate painting tradition of polychrome eland, often with underwater imagery because of the ontological linkages that were freshly made. And eventually those game populations thinned out, fishing intensifies. The dietary switch, which we didn't really get into, but it's in the paper, did not require ontological reconfigurations because those would have already been made with the ontological fusion of these various things. And anyway, this is just a plug for the paper. You can read about it probably in a more coherent fashion in the paper itself. Transactions of the Royal Society just came out recently, and then I'll hand it over to you, Sam, for the last thing, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say a last little bit about something that we haven't touched on yet, but that was one of the kind of founding principles of our hypothesis, and that was this cosmos compressed, which was in effect what you have in the highlands of Lesotho, we argue, the negotiation with these with the subaquatic entities, with kwa, the rivers, the rain animals, and the fish, right up in the in this spiritual hinterland, right up in the top of the Maloti-Drakensberg. So let's say the realm below the water is right up in the sky, and the terrestrial game and the rain, of course, being above, all coming down into this very compressed area, which is a band that people are living in when they get up into the high Maloti-Drakensberg for these aggregation phases of their annual circuit. And so that is arguably that is where we argue the association with the terrestrial entities and the subaquatic entities comes together and becomes they become associated with one another, and they sort of fuse together, which is why you then get these images of eland underwater with fish swimming past. That in itself would not necessarily be a very strong argument were it not for the dates that we have. And it was when Adolphine Bonneau and David Pearce published those dates that we said, this is what we think is going on, because we have these environmental proxies, we have the faunal and the floral proxies. We know roughly what people are doing. How would that affect you if you were a San person? So everything we do, of course, is ethnographically informed, and we try and get as close to the indigenous idiom as we possibly can. And this is the hypothesis that we come up with. And so this is why we think you have images like this. There are a handful of images in Underberg and over the border in Lesotho where you have people fishing from boats. And now you could be forgiven for thinking that was a narrative, unless, of course, you knew anything about San rock art and San cosmology, which prevents you from going that route, because arguably none of it is a depiction of daily life, or if it is daily life, then that daily life is imbued with spiritual considerations. And so here you have people fishing from boats, but one of them is among the fish. And Winnecombe herself thought perhaps that this was an earlier painting that had been painted around, because back in the 60s and 70s, at the outset, it hadn't been conceived of that necessarily these things were spiritual. That came later on. But now we can turn back to images like this and say, look, here is somebody who's negotiating with and influencing the subaquatic game and bringing them in. Yeah, I think I can leave it there, Brian, unless we've got anything more to say on these.
That's great, and then we'll just wrap up. I mean, so one of the future directions, of course, is trying to obtain dates on fish imagery and these fish paintings, of which there's not that many, but they're concentrated in the southern part of the Maloti-Drakensberg on both sides of the escarpment, and they're very suggestive, and we suggest maybe that they also would have begun potentially around this time as a working hypothesis. Also, they're painted in blacks, and so Adelphine, David, Sam, and I have begun to explore the possibility of beginning to obtain some samples of these to begin trying to chronologically anchor them as well, with a view to working them into this hypothesis. Here's that potential underwater game shaman, and beautifully, we also have, of course, shaded polychrome fish, and that's also highly suggestive for quite obvious reasons. And so, trying to obtain some chronological resolution for those guys would also be spectacular. Okay, we will leave it there. Thank you so much. Thanks to RARI and David for the invitation to speak, especially to Peter and Adrian for providing David, and of course for Adelphine and David Pierce for their fantastic work on obtaining dates finally that are rigorous and direct. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sam and Brian. That was wonderfully detailed and exciting stuff. I think we should get straight on to the questions. I see there's a question in the chat from Andre and Jeremy, or both of them, one or the other, I don't know. The question is, to what extent do depictions of a polychrome eland coincide with Owing and Polyhardy area, that is high up in the Maloti? The polychromes you use are at lower altitudes. And then a second part of that question, why the elaboration in terms of shading specifically? What is the reasoning?
I think, Sam, that's in your realm.
Is that in my wheelhouse?
I can buttress if you want, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm guessing that's Jeremy saying that. And I mean, these are very good questions. And so, of course, this is a working hypothesis that needs further work and further testing. So there he goes. Yes, it is. So to what extent they coincide with Owing and Polyhardy, we don't know. So but I wouldn't necessarily say that was a lacuna in the hypothesis. It's something that's going to be bolstered with projects going forward. So we've spoken with Adelphine and David about going into the High Maloti and getting dates. So I think Brian's got some funding left on his NSF grant for that. I've got a little bit of funding for that. So we're going to do some exploratory work there. The problem is it takes some time. So if I say watch this space, I think we're only looking at several years down the road before we get some decent dates out of the shaded polychromes. One thing we didn't touch on, I mean, if David is still here, he might be able to tell us a bit more about it. But unfortunately, all you can do is date the black. And even then, you've got to get a permit to take samples from the black on these shaded polychromes. The black is only found normally on the hoofs and the horns. And so in their work, you see where the samples have been, especially in the supplementary material of their work, you can see where the exact samples have been taken from with little tiny, the tip of a scalpel. And so it's very rare that you can find a painting that has the black, has sufficient thickness of black to be able to take a sample off the rock face, and that you can get a permit for. So that's why so much of the samples have been taken from places like Mount Tyndall, which is falling off the rock face, and so it's justifiable. And places like the Putiatsana, which has been flooded in the lowlands. So it's not easy, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's taken so long to get any dates at all. Not least, of course, the pre-treatment protocol that Adelphine developed. So it's very tricky to get those dates. So, but the weight of evidence coming out of those admittedly few directly dated shaded polychromes, as Brian said, does just they just fall within the neoglacial, and some of them slightly outside, because of course that's this is when it is likely to have started. But of course it carries on. The tradition carries on through, perhaps for different reasons. Other things are going to influence the outcome of that and why things change over time. One of the most interesting things that we're going to have to grapple with is the inflection point in the middle of the phase that we're talking about during the eland crash. And so to address the second part of your question there, why the elaboration in terms of shading specifically, we argue that this is part of the heightened negotiation with that entity that is eland. That entity that is eland is the thing with which you are brokering relations. Now, this is all stuff that has been only developed in terms of rock art research, in the last 5-6 years or so, following the arrival of one Mark McGranahan at RARI. And the work that some of us have been doing following that, Andrew Skinner, and I see Professor Matthias Gunther is there, who is an advocate and an ally on that level, and of course has had an entire career in the Kalahari, looking at the way that the San think. And so this sense of having to approach nicely and deal with and broker relations with another entity gets heightened at this time, and because of the nature and the motivation behind painting at all, is because you are dealing with these entities on the landscape. I think that is why you see the change suddenly when, and we argue this in the paper, all of the other browsers disappear. The medium and a lot of the small game just disappears because it can't survive in the neoglacial, and all you have left of the eland, and a couple of small bockies like raybuck. And it might even be the time when raybuck come to prominence as well. Aaron Maisel noticed this, that raybuck come in a certain period of time into the rock art, and that's a hard one to pin down. So yeah, there are lots of interrelated reasons to do with negotiation.
Yeah, there's a big, I mean, as Peter and Ina have pointed out, there's big faunal changeovers in the middle Holocene before this. Large grazers, mostly drop, most of them sort of drop out. And so by the end of the Holocene, there's like eland and, some equids, and there's not a whole lot of big game around. It's mostly small kind of territorial local browsers. And that can put up with the situation of a cooler later Holocene, and so it would be, I think, quite different in the middle Holocene if something like this had happened. You've got kind of a menu of large game to choose from, but that was not the case by the time this climatic effect sort of took hold. So
great, thanks very much for answering that question. Should we go now to Pippa Scottness? Pippa, are you with us?
I'm with you.
Welcome. Great. Good to see you.
I really loved this presentation. I thought it was fabulous, and it had me thinking of a dozen things. It reminded me initially of an encounter I had at a conference in Cambridge where James Sussman was sort of lounging in the background. And I did a talk on Blake and Lloyd, and at the end he sort of slouched forward and said, "You Blake and Lloyd people, you're so full of spirituality of these people. Have you ever sat around a campfire and listened to the scatological conversation?" And it sort of stuck in my mind. And I mean, Matthias will be able to talk to this, I'm sure, but it stuck in my mind. And when you were talking about spirituality a lot in the beginning, and then later on about thinking and behaving nicely. And I wonder if spirituality as an idea has not outlived its tenure. in terms of thinking about the kinds of things that you're saying, and that's something sort of less familiar to us, so that we don't call up these obvious tropes of spirituality. Something like, thinking nicely or behaving nicely in the way it's used, like in Black and White, is not a more powerful way of describing the things that you've been talking about. And in that sense, it also made me think about, and I often don't like these kinds of analogies, but it made me think about, the collapse of the Catholic Empire with the beginning of the Reformation, and the growth of this incredible individual virtuosity in depicting religious themes, so that in the end, they were not about so much the religion, but they were about, the perfection of the scientific idea of one-point perspective, for instance. And then when I look at these polychromed eland and the extraordinary virtuosity of their depiction, and then you end with that magnificent painting of the man rising above the teeming fish and the little ships, almost in a kind of Jesus-like figure there. I wonder if there isn't some correlation between what you're also talking about as heightened negotiation with, the idea of the eland, and the growth of this incredible individual virtuosity of the painter himself, able to do the things in the way that move us because we recognize that virtuosity. Not something you recognize in the Cederberg, for instance. And you're drawing in the ecological and the weather factors and the movement of the eland and so on. I think is a wonderful way of starting to think about these kinds of things. Although, again, then it troubles me when you talk to someone like Megan Beasley, who always says these individuals never rise up. They're always trying to, grope for equality and so on. But I wonder if something else wasn't going on there. Sorry, I've been all over the place, but
that's great. No, maybe Sam, I could just address quickly the first part of that, and you can hit the second. Is that cool? I love that. I love those comments. I think we're and thanks to you and Matthias and others. We have a luxury. Those of us who work in the subcontinent, with the ethnohistoric and ethnographic records are just out of control. I mean, they're amazing, and I think this is one of the few parts of the world where we actually can now push beyond spirituality to talk about specific things without always having to hark back to this sort of moniker and hanging that. We can talk about aspects within that, the cosmology of the sign. Now, one reason we use it still is to signal to other colleagues of ours who are not as inclined that's what we're talking about, and it's kind of annoying to have to do that. I actually, the exact thing you're talking about has annoyed me. Of the last couple of papers, I always have that in the title, and it sounds like it right from the outset. You're artificially breaking the rules of what sort of the new animisms has taught us, is that spirituality is just part of life. It's not its own thing, I think we have a real luxury in Southern Africa to speaking to the audience of Southern Africanists. We can start to actually move beyond that and actually be more specific. When we broaden out and we're talking to larger audiences, we probably do have to still use those, at least for excavate, non-rock art specialists, for other kinds of archaeologists or ethnographers and so on, because it's that's a small portion of the larger excavated archaeological world that people are working to infuse more kind of functionalist and mundane sort of explanations. Sam, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't agree more, and thank you, Pippa, for such an insightful question, because it goes to the heart of one of the main problems that I think we all face when we're trying to describe our work to others. So I do things like I use the word religion to provoke people into falling into that sort of pitfall, that trap of saying no, but it's not religion, because religion, we know, looks like this. It's Islam, it's Judeo-Christianity, and you say no, it's not. Religion for these guys is the way you hunt. And they say, no, that's not the way. It's not the way you hunt. Hunting, we all know, is daily life. That's separate. And you just have to keep banging your head against that brick wall and say, no, when these guys go out hunting, They are exercising their religious belief. It's one and the same thing. So I was saying this to my first years yesterday. We were revising something, and I was saying, when a San person is hunting in the Kalahari, and they say, in order to get that kudu there, I have to think myself into it. I've got to become like it. I've got to go into this state where I become that kudu, and Matthias can elaborate on this ad infinitum, I'm sure. And outsiders would say, no, this is ridiculous. Of course, that's not got anything to do with it. He's just hunting eland. You just run after it and you spear it. Don't be silly. And he'd say, no, I can't get that animal unless I do this. It's not possible. You can't follow it. You can't just stick it with a poison arrow and follow the spoor in the sort of technically mundane sort of way. That doesn't work. And in any case, that's not respectful. And so all of these respect behaviors and things like that are part and parcel of the same thing. It's religion. And so, this was, Mark and my paper was reconfiguring hunting magic, because of course hunting magic had a really bad rap over the years, and because of the simplistic sort of one-to-one, Gary Larson cartoon of a bison on a cave wall with an arrow in its bum. Maybe if I draw this, maybe I'll get one tomorrow, or this is what happened yesterday, that kind of nonsense. Well, it's not that, but it's the hunting magic is all of these things combined. So yeah, it's an opportunity to reiterate to pay homage to people like Matthias for supplying us with the copious amounts of ethnography and in interpreting the right way, I would say, in his case, and to you for making available the Blake Lloyd, so that over the last 10 years or so we have actually been able to get into the nuts and bolts. And so I don't know if that, it's another way of looking at that word spirituality, but it's all down to what it conjures up in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And so sometimes you have to be quite strict and say to the beholder, look, it's not yours. This doesn't belong to you. It's not your religion. You're looking at a rock art that doesn't belong to you. It's not up for grabs. And this is what David would tell us. It's not for you. You can only look at it in these ways, and there has to come from as close as possible to the indigenous perspective as you can possibly get. Otherwise, it's just not valid.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry, Pippa, I think just for the sake of time, in case they're new questions, we can always come back to continuing the conversation. But Stefan, if you would like to go ahead with your question.
Thanks for that. Very interesting talk. Oh, there goes my camera. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I'm particularly interested in these neoglacial periods and putting them in the broader context of rain and rainmaking and the availability of water during such times. And when I think about these neoglacial periods, I would anticipate that you would have had lengthy periods where those rivers, even in the lower reaches of Lesotho, were dry because the waters were held up in a frozen state during the winter months, and that you would have an accumulation of precipitation, so to speak, through the winter period as snowfall, probably from as early as April until probably late September, October. And then you would have this flush of abundant water supply during spring, probably in November. Even if it didn't rain in November, you would have this meltwater. And the early missionaries in Lesotho alluded to this in a couple of years or so. They would speak of the floods stemming from this meltwater of the snows that had accumulated in the mountain highlands. And so maybe this is just something to keep in mind also in terms of the mass spawning of fish during those times, that, this concept of rain is maybe separate from the availability of water. So we need to perhaps think around those two things separately. Water availability versus rain doesn't always equate during such times because of the way in which the precipitation fell as snow. Thanks. So it's more a comment, but something to keep in mind.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, we definitely thought of, we didn't get into it much, but we thought about the snow and how during these periods, of course, it would last longer. And so everything would have been quite compressed. I mean, this would have been challenging, and so timing really was everything. But yeah, no, I must admit we didn't consider snow being such a huge contributor, if indeed it was to the river volume. But it's also true though, Stefan. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, that the seasonality, maybe you would have had a bit more winter precipitation during these kind of cold phases. But summer rains would have kicked in, right? And that would have changed the potentiality of the terrestrial landscape, and presumably around that time. So it's possible that the rivers were flooding, and that was largely snow melt driven, as you say. But also you would have had you would have had a rejuvenation of the veldt as those spring rains hit at roughly the same time, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So I think that's exactly
great.
it. You would have probably had the accumulation of snow plus spring rains. And so it would have probably been a regular phenomena during those times to have substantial floods and floodwaters and a lot of water flushing down those rivers, especially during springtime. But probably on the reverse, an absence of water in those river systems during the winter period, because it would have been held up in a frozen state higher up.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. We should keep talking. That's great. It's really great. Peter.
Peter, go ahead.
Sorry.
Hi, thank you. That was extremely enjoyable. That's one of the most enjoyable afternoons I've had for quite a long time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Almost as enjoyable as seeing Sam perched on the top of that ladder, which absolutely terrified me. I've got a couple of thoughts or comments, one of which, in a sense, is just inspired by what Stefan just said, and he of course, is probably the only other one of us who's been to Dikwaeng. And that goes back to what you were saying about rain, or beliefs in the rain animal not being necessarily just about the production of rain, but more also about the control of weather as a whole, because those floods could potentially have been very powerful and very damaging, affecting the availability of fish, availability of plant foods, and so on. So there's maybe another angle there too, in terms of that dimension of the control of weather to think about. You're obviously both right in saying that one of the things that would be ideal would be to get some more paintings dated, and particularly to try and get paintings dated inside Lesotho, if it's possible to work with the Department of Culture to take that forward. But I think maybe one of the other kinds of paintings that would be interesting to date, not only the eland and the fishing scenes, would also be to look at rain animal scenes. Sam and other people who are there in Joburg will have far more of an idea of this than me, but there is really a striking concentration in that Sahong area. Sahong, the rain snake shelter, Dikwaeng. And I wonder to what extent there is that unusual? How much more of that is there in that part of the Maloti-Drakensberg as a whole? And if it is spatially unusual, as I think it might be, it will be fascinating to know whether that painting tradition or those aspects of it that survive have a comparable antiquity to the eland that you were talking about earlier on. That's one thing. So more dates, but also I think dates about rain animals. The other thing about rain animals, which Sam certainly knows about, is, but which David Whittleson might enjoy, is to think about also how these specific images are depicted in relation to where they are physically on the landscape. The Sahong rain animal, as Brian may also know, is walking towards a crack in the rock surface from which moisture comes out after even the slightest shower. The rain snake is being dragged into a pool directly in front of it in the Senku. And it crosses my mind now that, of course, the rain animal that Sam traced at Dikwayang is also walking downstream along the Dikwayang towards the Senku itself. So at a microscopic level, there's an interesting topographic performative element there perhaps as well. The other two things that crossed my mind, one is that it will be fascinating to see how this fits with the emerging body of evidence from Podihadi, which, all being well, will be in print in June of next year. And the other thing is that while I have the most enormous respect for the Middle Stone Age, it would be wonderful if we could get somebody to start looking for some other later Holocene sites, or to excavate at later Holocene sites, because with the greatest, and I've said this in print, but with the greatest respect for Pat Carter, we have all been following in his footsteps, literally, for the last 30 odd years or so. And it really is time that someone actually branched out and looked at some smaller sites, and sites which would focus in more on the Holocene, because while I think you've made a really eloquent and elegant argument, Dikwayang is, of course, one site, and it's obviously not representative of everything that the people who were occupying it were doing. So some more holes in the ground would be very welcome.
Yeah, and we to shore up the argument so we didn't get sort of stabbed summarily by everybody. And towards the end of the paper, we say exactly that. I mean, it's a testament to the preservation, the kind of freak preservation of that site, which we are admittedly capitalizing on. That is an unusual, thing, and it's great that you saw it in time and you did something about it. But absolutely, we need more of them. I mean, and it can't be alone. It just can't be.
No, there have similar sites, and there must be rock shelters that were occupied at the same time. I mean, some of them may be up in Podihadi. And that, I guess, is the last thing, which some of us have already talked about. If any of you who are listening or watching have not been there, next year's ASAPA conference in Lesotho may provide a perfect opportunity, because the area's got great archaeology and it's very, very well worth. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Great
Peter.
comments.
Yes, I think we're all looking forward to that trip to Lesotho. Sam, was there something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, Peter. Thanks for walking past Dikwayang that day when you noticed the section eroding out of the side of the
You know
river.
why I found it, don't you?
Sorry?
You know why? You know how I found it?
I can't remember.
I hope nobody will object if I dip into slightly not totally polite Afrikaans for a moment. We had gone on a hike that was about 25 kilometers long around the whole periphery of the Sahong village, trying to relocate a number of Pat Carter's and Pat Vinicum sites when I was digging at Sahong in '92. And by about 4:30 in the afternoon, I was, to use a very colloquial expression, gat vol of going in and out of one donga after the other. And I thought, to hell with this, I'm going to walk along in the dried up riverbed on the side of the Senku. And I looked up, and that's where it was. So only because I was tired of going in and out of dongas did I find it. And of course, the irony is that is the one stretch, and it's only about a kilometre or so long. It's the one stretch of that whole area where Pat Carter and Pat Vinicum did not go in 1971. They went up to just south of it, and they started up again just north of it, but they didn't go there, presumably because of the difficulty of crossing the river at the time, because there was no way across other than going straight through the water. There was no bridge at all at that point. So being tired can lead you to archaeological sites. I guess that's the moral of that particular story.
And I just wanted to add, I think it was you said it was only when you had the whole team there and you were excavating that somebody noticed the rock art right up, sort of 6 meters up in the rock shelter that was around the corner. So you have to spend time in these places as well. But I should also point out that because obviously Vinicum, and I don't know if Carter was there on the day, found rain snake shelter, which is only just a little way downstream, of course, that little tiny kranz line that contains a couple of little small rock art shelters, tiny little shelters. The kranz line is cut in a lot of places. It has cut marks along it. So not only do you have the painted cut marks that Jeremy and I noticed and traced, painted marks on the snake's body that correspond with the cut marks on the rock that you're sitting on, so the cutting of the snake, but that as you walk along the kranz line, there are cut marks in sort of seemingly random places, not always inside shelters, sometimes just on the slope going up in the rock. And then when you're standing on the opposite bank of the Senku, you look across the river and the entire kranz line looks like an undulating serpent, if you choose to look at it like that. I mean, so this is formed part of Andrew Skinner's PhD, and so elements of that are getting published. Been published sort of one of them's been published in the last sort of year or so. So yeah, getting into that. So I think and so to tie that back in with your comment on trying to date the rain animals is also imperative. So you're absolutely right. It's got to go hand in glove with the attempt to date the eland and the fish. Those blackfish. I suspect a lot of those blackfish are much later and not in the Neoglacial. But we've tried to also say that we think this is the beginning, and that the ontological leaning towards that coupling seems to have continued.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sam. I think unless there are no further pressing questions, we're going to have to, unfortunately, bring the seminar to a close. But I would like to congratulate our speakers for one of the most interesting seminars that we've had, the most detailed, certainly one of the longest, and to all of those in the audience for joining us and staying with us. I think it's a testament to how interesting this stuff is. I think we're at a very interesting time in the history of Southern African rock art research, where we've got dates, we've got ethnography, we've got paintings, and we're not arguing the toss about over their relevance. We all recognize the crucial insight and just the value that these things bring. So I think it just falls to me to say thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure there are discussions that are going to keep going, so please keep talking, and we look forward to seeing you at the next seminar. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
everyone.
David.
Bye-bye.
Don't you? Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Andrej and Jeremy.
Cheers.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the nice and insightful comments. That was really nice. I'm looking forward to discussing
this was from Jeremy. This was from Jeremy.
Yeah, I guessed. No, I mean, and not wrong as well. Yeah, that's all stuff that still needs doing.
Okay then. Okay.
Cheery, bye.
Bye. Bye.